Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be concentrating on giving you the tools and support you need in order to answer the Shakespeare essay question in paper 1 of the literature exam. Today we're going to focus on Romeo and Juliet and specifically the plot structure and the events to ensure that we understand how all of the events link together. Your first assessment objective requires you to know and understand that play and be able to respond cohesively to a question. And so it's important that you know what happens when, what leads to what, so that you can put that into context when you answer your essay. So, Romeo and Juliet is a Shakespearean tragedy, and as such, it has a structure that looks like this. So, there is the inevitable ending. We know that it's inevitable because we know it's a tragedy. And from the prologue, we are told that both Romeo and Juliet will die. This is the resolution. We start in Act 1 with a status quo. Everything is as it should be. Verona is happily bobbing along. Romeo at this point is in love with Rosaline. And Juliet is a child who has no wish to be married. Now, throughout Act 1 and Act 2, we get that rising tension. This culminates in Romeo and Juliet's marriage. So at that point, we know that something's going to happen. We know that there is going to be some sort of climax. And that occurs in Act 3, when off the back of the marriage, Romeo has no desire to fight Tybalt. And as such, Mercutio steps in, kills Tybalt, fights Tybalt, sorry. Tybalt kills Mercutio. And then Romeo kills Tybalt. It's that series of events that leads to the inevitable ending. Romeo is banished. And off the back of that fight, that death, Capulet insists that Juliet marries Paris. So throughout Act 4, we have the inevitable journey towards the place where Juliet feels she has no choice but to kill herself. And it's at this point that the friar comes up with the plan. What you have to recognise is that throughout this, you are building up to a key moment that then needs resolving. And that is how the structure of the play works. We already know here what is going to happen here, but it's finding out how it happens and what events have a knock-on effect. It's really key that you understand that every event in the play leads to another event, and therefore it's important that you know the order of the events in the play. So Act 1 begins and we have Romeo introduced. He is in love with Rosaline. He's unhappy about this because Rosaline has already rejected him, and he feels as though he doesn't understand what's going on around him. We are also introduced to Juliet, who is introduced as a child. She is still under the care of her father. We know that she is 13 years old, and therefore at this point, knowing that Romeo is in love with Rosaline, we're not really sure how they are going to meet. The play also opens with the fight, showing us the depth of the feud, showing us the issues with Romeo and Juliet's relationship. Now, by the end of Act 1, we've had the masked ball. Romeo and Juliet have met and fallen in love. As we move into Act 2, Romeo and Juliet meet up again. They already know that they can't be together, and yet they are so compelled to see each other that Romeo goes to the Capulets' orchard and they agree to be married. Romeo goes to the friar, and the friar agrees to marry them because he believes it will end the feud. Okay, so already Romeo is going to the party to try and get over Rosaline, or at least to try and see her. Juliet is going to be there. We know that they can't be together. They meet and fall in love, and this is the first point where you see the church heavily involved, with the friar agreeing to marry them to end the feud. By the end of Act 2, they are married. But as a result of Romeo going to the ball, Tybalt has challenged him. So Act 3 opens with Tybalt looking for Romeo. Because he is now related to Tybalt, Romeo refuses the fight. Because the marriage is a secret, none of his friends understand why. And so Mercutio fights on his behalf. Tybalt kills Mercutio. Romeo kills Tybalt. And so already we can see that every action has had an impact. Rosaline's rejection of Romeo leads to him going to the masked ball in order to cheer himself up, leads to him meeting Juliet and falling in love, leads to them getting married, leads to Tybalt challenging him to a fight. Their relationship means that Romeo refuses to fight Tybalt, but then his devastation at the death of Mercutio means that Romeo is overwhelmed by emotion and still kills Tybalt. At this point, Romeo is banished. So Juliet is a new wife. No one knows she's a wife. And off the back of his nephew's death, in order to cheer everyone up and to ensure his family's continuation, Capulet demands that Juliet marries Paris. Now, because she's already married, it would have been a sin, and it would have been a betrayal of her husband. And so Juliet initially refuses her father. When she realises there's no way out, she goes to the friar and asks for his help. The friar suggests a plan. And that plan is that Juliet takes a potion that fakes her death and that he smuggles her out to meet Romeo. No one will ever know, no one will ever get hurt, and they can live happily ever after somewhere else. This all relies on the friar getting word to Romeo that this is what's happened. And unfortunately, the messenger doesn't get to Romeo. And so the first thing Romeo hears is that Juliet is dead. And because he is so devastated by her death, he rushes back to Verona, determined to take his own life because he cannot live in a world without her. The friar realises that the message hasn't got through and also rushes to the tomb to try and intercept. Romeo gets to the tomb first. Paris tries to stop him because Paris doesn't realise that Romeo is in love with Juliet, and Romeo kills him. He goes into the tomb, sees Juliet there, drinks his poison and dies. At this point, Juliet wakes up. The friar is there. The friar tries to persuade her to leave, but again, she cannot imagine living in a world without Romeo, so she kills herself. The friar tells the story. And both Capulet and Montague are so devastated by the death of their children that they agree to end the feud. Each of these events is in some way affected by, leads on to, dictate what comes next. We know at the beginning of the play that Romeo and Juliet will die. The only question is how that will happen. And at every point, if either of them had made different decisions, then the inevitable ending never would have happened. And so you need to understand how each event leads into the next one in order to understand the action of the play and be able to write about the characters. So, with this in mind, your task is to explain how Romeo's rejection by Rosalind leads to his death. You will need to understand how each event has a knock-on effect to the other and explain in 2 or 3 paragraphs how Rosaline not loving Romeo leads to Romeo dying.